Okay, so we are now in chapter 10, which is the second agency chapter. So we want to kind of think of the first chapter is how to create agency. And in this chapter, we're talking about kind of the sources of agency power and then also termination thereof. All right, so there will be several mini lectures associated with this chapter. But let's start in with a discussion of the sources, I should say, of authority for agents. And so agents' authority, which really in truth is to stand in their shoes and contract on behalf of the principal. Well, it comes from two sources. All right, it can be actual authority, or it can be apparent. All right. Um, and so the actual authority comes in two kind of subgroups, being the express authority or the implied authority. All right. Um, so express authority, think contract law from 2080. The principal and the agent have agreed, either orally in writing, into the scope of authority that the agent will have to represent the principal. All right, so that's really just contract law. All right, express authority comes in from that point. All right. Implied authority, however, are the things that are not agreed upon explicitly, but are necessary to achieve the objectives of the agency. All right. So I think I set up an example that we'll talk through on the next slide. So we'll work through a few examples. All right. Apparent authority. All right. In apparent authority, there's no agency agreement, no contractual agreement, but the principal's actions indicate to a third party that the employee or agent has authority to do certain things. All right, and there's some parallels here with examples that I used in the previous chapter, but let's move on to the next slide. All right, so express authority, um, basically contract law, right? Written or oral agreement between the principal and the agent. All right, one thing to keep in mind is the equal dignity rule. You may remember the statute of frauds from financial accounting. Those are contracts that have to be in writing to be legally enforceable. And by extension, agency agreements to enter those types of contracts also need to be in writing. And that's all the equal dignity rule is. So the statute of frauds exceptions, I didn't put them on the slides. I'm not really going to test it again. But there were 5, right? The sale of interest in land, contracts in consideration of marriage, i.e. prenups, the year contracts that cannot be performed in a year, surety, ship or guarantee, sale of goods in excess of $500. So those are your contracts that have to be in writing to be enforceable. So if I hire a real estate agent, well, that's an interest in land. Well, under the equal dignity rule, that agency agreement would have to be written. Failure to have it in writing means that the principal can avoid any contract that the agent would enter into. All right, so implied authority, and I wrote out an example here. And let's just bear with me, we'll read through it. Maverick owns a Cessna 172 airplane. Magna decides he needs a bigger plane and hires Jack to sell the Cessna for him. Jack takes out a half-page ad in Private Pilot Monthly, a regional magazine targeted at persons who might be interested in buying the plane. Maverick did not expressly grant Jack the authority to take out the ad. Did Jack have the authority to take out the ad? Well, authority comes from a couple of sources, right? So let's think about express authority. No, express authority was not there because Maverick and Jack didn't expressly say, feel free. They didn't agree that Jack would have the authority to take out the advertisement. All right. However, the objective was to sell the plane. All right. And it is reasonable that you would advertise to sell the plane. So the next tells us Jack would have had the implied authority to take out the ad because that's reasonable action taken to sell the plane, and that means that Maverick would be obligated to reimburse Jack for the cost of the ad. Jack has not exceeded his authority under the agency agreement because he had the implied authority to take out the ad. Now, you might ask, well, what if Maverick didn't really want the ad taken out? Well, you have an opportunity to define your agency when you sit down and contract and agree for the agency relationship. So if you really didn't want an ad taken out, Maverick would have needed to articulate that in the agency agreement. Okay. Apparent authority. All right. And I've got a couple of examples here. One's in the text, Lundberg versus Church Farms. And that's the thoroughbred case. Where, and I'll just nutshell it. Another farm contracts Church Farms to have their mares bred with a certain stallion. A stallion that has a coveted bloodline. Well, they represent a certain employee as manager, and that manager guarantees, I think, 5 live foals from the breeding, and that does not happen. Right? I think they end up with 1 or less than 5, and the lawsuit ensues. And the reality is that the manager didn't have the actual authority to make those guarantees like that. However, he did have the apparent authority because Church Farms represented him as the manager. He was the person that was in contact with the Lundbergs as they were negotiating their transaction. All right, so that's an example of apparent authority. All right, which is legally binding, right? Much to the chagrin or disappointment of Church Farms. Apparent authority binds just like actual authority. All right. The next example, and this is one that I created. Thomas owns a Cadillac dealership. Thomas has employed Samuel for several years as a janitor. Clint enters the dealership in shoddy clothes. Thomas, believing that Clint does not have the means to purchase a Cadillac, introduces Samuel as a salesperson and then walks away. All right. Clint and Samuel spend about 45 minutes together, and Clint agrees to purchase a Cadillac for substantially below market value. All right. When Thomas learns of the agreement, he is furious and seeks to avoid it. Will Thomas be forced to honor the contract that Samuel and Clint entered into or agreed to? Well, Samuel is a janitor. right? Not a salesperson. So we know that Samuel does not have the actual authority to sell the vehicle. However, Thomas's introduction to Clint of Samuel as a salesperson gives him the apparent authority to do so. All right. So what this means is that Thomas is going to be obligated to sell the Cadillac to the terms that Samuel and Clint agreed upon. Right. The below market terms obviously favorable to Clint. And the reason being is because conduct, right? Conduct is key. The conduct of a principal creates apparent authority. By introducing Samuel as a salesperson, he now has the authority of a salesperson. Or in Lundberg versus Church Farms, by representing the manager as having authority to conduct all portions of the sale, anything that he said is part of the deal, right? So when we think of apparent authority, we want to think of agency created by the conduct of principle, right? Okay, that's it for this lecture. We'll be back momentarily.